All right, quick intro today. Episode 39 of Researching Happy. I'm Dr. Matthew Iasiello, trying to bring you the latest ideas and evidence in wellbeing research direct from the academics who create it. So today we have Dr. Xavier Symons, who is the director of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics at the Australian Catholic University. He's just come back to Australia. Prior to this, he was a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. His research interests include ethical issues at the beginning and end of life, conscientious objection, the ethics of resource allocation, and the philosophy of well-being. So really quite simple stuff that he focuses on. This is a conversation that jumps between two papers by Xavier and his colleagues, one critically examining Aristotle's concept of flourishing, and one that considers flourishing at the end of life or in dying. And this is really fascinating work. And the biggest takeaway, spoiler alert, is the idea, as Xavier describes, that there are potentially unique well-being experiences that we can only reach in dying. Which for us, probably in the West, completely flips the whole idea on its head. We talk about the risks of defining well-being as reaching our full potential, which really makes flourishing unreachable in older age, when we define that as a time of physical decline. And so this has so many implications for anyone working in aged care, disability, palliative care, medicine, sort of you name it. So thank you again to Xavier for his time. Please make sure you share this episode and check out researchinghappy.com to learn more about our upcoming guests and to get the chance to submit some of your own questions for future episodes. So thanks and enjoy. All right, this is Researching Happy, and today we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Xavier Symons. I forgot to ask, Symons or Symons?
No worries. Symons. I'm not
Symons.
fast, but Symons technically.
Okay. Technically, is there some other way that you could think about it?
Well, I mean, I don't hold people to account for
Okay.
the way they pronounce my last name.
Oh,
That's all
look,
I'm saying.
probably no surprise. I'm in the exact same boat, so that's
Yeah.
completely cool. Very cool. So, welcome, Xavier. It's a pleasure to have you. What we're going to do today is we're going to learn a little bit about yourself. We're going to talk about one of your papers. That's this new format of the show that I'm trying to stick to. I'm already breaking it because I think today we'll probably talk across two of your papers, but I think researchers' ideas progress over time, and you have to sort of draw the parallels between the work. And then we'll sort of have a bit of an open chat, and we've got a couple of questions from some listeners as well. So kicking off with yourself, tell us, you're recently back in Australia. What kind of work do you do? What were you doing overseas, and what's drawn you to all this work that you do?
Thanks, Matt. So, yeah, very happy to talk a little bit about my journey. So I'm a philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy, which I completed at the Australian Catholic University, and I wrote my thesis on uh, contemporary theories of distributive justice and the allocation of healthcare resources. So I started off in philosophy, and since graduating from my PhD, I've pivoted into the healthcare ethics bioethics space. I did a Fulbright postdoctoral research fellowship at Georgetown University at the Kennedy Institute for Ethics, looking at ethical issues in dementia and dementia care. And then I also spent a couple of years at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, researching in the philosophy of well-being and assisting the research team at that institute with survey design for surveys on human flourishing, its determinants and distribution across different communities, different demographic groups. Before coming back to Australia, I've only just arrived back actually, well, relatively recently, and 3 months ago. And I'm now running a small ethics centre at the Australian Catholic University, the Plunkett Centre for Ethics. And we mainly work with the Catholic health sector, um, providing ethics capacity for the sector and assisting with ethical issues arising in both clinical care as well as organizational management. So kind of ethics throughout the vertical structure of the organization, we kind of have input at all different levels. So I've had a fairly, I think, interesting and circuitous journey to where I am now. But to some extent, I would say it's all related. And I think working more specifically in bioethics now, I would definitely say that it's really useful to have obviously background in philosophy and related fields, but also I think a good understanding of human well-being, because I think in the end, a lot of the big questions that arise in ethics in medicine and healthcare relate to very fundamental issues of like what it means to live a good life, what is quality of life, how can we improve the way we care for people who are sick and vulnerable. So,
Yeah, well, and it is really. I can imagine some of those ethical questions. They're as pointed a question as could be for someone in healthcare to be asking themselves.
that's right, and I definitely would say that's another aspect of this field that attracted me to it. When I finished my philosophy studies, I was wondering what might be a useful, well, not so much, sounds a bit utilitarian, but what might be a very, I think, a very meaningful application of my philosophical training, and I kind of very quickly worked out that in healthcare ethics, there's a series of very important ethical questions which require quite careful philosophical analysis and really, in a way, represent a very close intersection between theory on the one hand, metaphysics, moral theory, philosophy of well-being, and practice on the other hand, clinical care, quality of life, the goals of medicine, and so on. So, yeah, definitely interested in those questions.
Yeah, amazing. Excuse me. And yeah, just as a side note, I guess Professor Jennifer Frey or Dean Jennifer Frey, who we've had on the show before, she keeps tweeting about how employable philosophy majors are, which I think is a nice point that like you said about the sort of the utilitarian sense of it all, but actually there's really valuable life skill or employment skills, which probably the average person wouldn't guess. I don't know.
I would think that's true, and it's regrettable because I think historically there's been a kind of prestige attached to philosophy and philosophical training. Um, Admittedly, since the dawn of philosophy, philosophers have been criticized for being abstruse, but also in a way I think challenging social and political conventions in a way that might be problematic for people who just want to kind of get by, get on with their kind of promoting their own self-interest
Yeah,
and sort of stick
pesky
to the status
philosophers.
quo.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right. But I think in the end, that's what philosophy, when done well, contributes. Is it kind of asks those pointed, important fundamental questions about how we ought to live our lives, how we ought to structure society and politics, and also like where there are problems in society, and also like in different fields of our shared lives, like for example, uh, professional life or industry, that we do identify those problems and analyze them carefully and come up with sound ethical solutions for how to proceed.
Yeah, amazing. And that kind of the is ought sort of discrepancy, what is versus what ought to be. I don't, is that Hume? I don't know. You tell me. I'm probably wrong, but
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think Hume brought skepticism to bear on moral philosophy, and in that way was a key player in modern or kind of Enlightenment moral philosophy. And there are a lot of people I think who would think that Hume was on the money with the is or distinction. But I think really what Hume drew our attention to is the need to reflect more deeply on how morality relates to nature. And that is a very important question. And I think, in a way, really what it does is instead of pointing us toward global moral skepticism, it actually points us back to Aristotle. and the way in which the good intersects with reality and with being.
That is one of those sentences where it's like, I think I need to hear about that for another 6 hours. I think how the good intersects, I'm just writing it down, intersects with reality. That's really cool. Very cool. All right, awesome. So in terms of exciting parts of the work, what are the exciting parts? What are the challenges? Are there frustrations?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. I mean, I think what I'm doing at the moment is very much kind of professional ethics, and so I'm finding like my work is much more consequential than it was immediately consequential than maybe previous work I was doing, which I think was also important, but perhaps the impact was more diffuse and gradual. So in a way, I'm working a lot with doctors and clinical teams and hospital executives now to think about important questions of policy. And so, depending on the ethical analysis we provide, like that can change hospital policy on kinds of services they provide and also the way in which they provide. So, I think that there's a challenge in that. Uh, if you want to be a good ethicist, you want to say what you think is right. But if you're being employed by, I think, a business essentially, then there's this tension that you also don't want to kind of, I think, misrepresent or kind of not give due attention to just the sort of the very important need for the business to be viable and to
Mm-hmm.
continue and to operate in a kind of complex environment where um, perhaps if you're a bit too scrupulous, like that could potentially like undermine the provision of, in this case, healthcare. So I would say that there's certain challenges that come with that, but I would like to give a bit of a shout out, I think, to the Catholic health sector, which I think in Australia at least has been a bit of a trailblazer in fostering bioethical reflection and creating um, positions like employing bioethicists who do serious bioethical reflection and in a way that I think demonstrates a kind of like a, a desire to like create a more ethical culture, like a
Yeah.
really noble desire to create a more ethical culture. And the great thing is like now, I mean, I'm sort of thinking more like 30, 40 years ago, really, when bioethics was just getting started in Australia. I think that now across the sector, like faith-based or just secular, all kind of health services are starting to really take ethics very seriously, and that's wonderful. But I would say there was a kind of pioneering work done by the Catholic health sector. So yeah, that's just a little bit about challenges, but also interesting aspects of my work, and I think as well. I mean, my hope is that with the future of bioethics in Australia and globally is that we're able to sort of identify, I think, how kind of practice intersects with broader questions in philosophy and
Mm-hmm.
theology, even because I think we do ourselves a disservice if we just reduce bioethics to kind of an empirical discipline or a sort of a form of like empirical analysis with a little bit of kind of ethics sprinkled on top. I think we need to have a kind of a rich and deep approach to analyzing questions of ethical ethics, and I think that's what philosophy brings to the conversation.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, this is, I don't know if this is off topic, so you can refocus me again if you like, but this kind of question of morality and value. So when we're talking about well-being, we're sort of talking a little bit about defining the good. There's this kind of conversation that's happening about this idea of sort of the West being like the fish in the fishbowl without recognizing it's steeped in Christian values and Christian morality. With even was it Dawkins recently saying he's calling himself like a cultural Christian, which is I think a huge admission. From my perspective, how much is that part of the frustration here? Like you're having to make decisions and help inform decisions in healthcare. Where does the source of morality come from, if not Christianity? If that makes sense.
That does make sense, and I think there's something to that. That in the end, I mean, I was just literally having a conversation last night with several people, one of whom was actually the Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher, and also a law student. And the question was raised: can we have a secular basis for human rights? Like, is there a kind of defensible secular basis for human rights? And I think what the Archbishop said in this case was that, and he's, I mean, a trained philosopher, was that yes, you can have a secular basis for human rights. Like, there is a kind of a common sense morality argument for basic ideas, like we should respect the right to life of all human beings. We should respect human dignity at all stages. People should have the capacity to realize their basic kind of human potential, and in a sense that can form a kind of blueprint for the way in which we theorize human rights today. But it's important to note as well, though, that in the end, like that kind of way of thinking about these questions, in the end, has its pedigree in the Christian era, and the first kind of theorists of rights were Christian theologians. So I think that that's important, and also even like the motivational force that it's attached to human rights. I think that it's difficult to, when the chips are down, defend human dignity, particularly of the poor and vulnerable, when there are all sorts of other pressures like utilitarian pressures, economic pressures. I think a kind of a skepticism about rights. It's difficult to defend rights at those times, and that's where I think religion and religious institutions in society become particularly important as kind of champions of these moral values.
Yeah. I think I'd be much more convinced of the Archbishop's argument if I did see a society who got to those conclusions, independently. I guess, to your point.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think contingently speaking, we are the inheritors of a rich intellectual tradition of Christianity, and even if we are a post-Christian society, that still implies that we were once a Christian society. In a certain sense, like we're responding to a certain body of reflection that is Christian, and so in a sense, like, love it or hate it, you're sort of stuck with it. It's part of our history and culture, and I think in the end, a very important and good part, I would argue, given its kind of this part of its patrimony. Is these values, these important kind of foundational civilizational values.
Yeah, I would agree. This is very interesting to me. I know that I don't know whether it's interesting to others, so we'll keep on rolling with the topic that we're
good idea.
supposed to be talking about. But if there are any books or articles or anything you can recommend me on that idea, I'm all open. Anyway, talking.
Yeah. I mean, I think just very briefly, I would say, I mean, in terms of kind of the foundations of morality and Christianity, I think, to be honest, the writings of Pope Benedict XVI, are very, very good on this. And I know that's a kind of a theological work. So, I mean, but I would say, like, regardless of whether you're a person of faith or no faith at all, I would say, like, the writings of Pope Benedict are fantastic, very, very rich, intellectually sophisticated and accessible to all people.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm just making a note of that. Thank you. All right. So this idea of Aristotelian flourishing, with the paper at hand. So we're really talking, I guess, between two of your papers. Aristotelian, the first is published along with Professor Tyler Vanderweel, Aristotelian Flourishing and Contemporary Philosophical Theories of Wellbeing. Very, very interesting read. But kind of juxtaposing, I guess, that article with a preprint that's out at the moment that you can find on ResearchGate, which is Flourishing at the End of Life. One thing that I loved when I was reading your work is this idea that many in the wellbeing space claim this Aristotelian ancestry, and yet they might not necessarily be as close as they claim. It would be great to get just I don't know if this is possible, a 2-minute or a 5-minute sketch of the sort of the way you sort of constructed the Aristotelian framework of flourishing?
I think it's true to say that Aristotle really was like the first theorist of well-being, along with Plato, in a certain sense. And it is true to say as well that contemporary studies of well-being has been heavily influenced by Aristotle. But my concern, Matthew, is that I think the kind of invoking of an Aristotelian pedigree is used very loosely in the literature. And I think, in fact, that we need to be a little bit careful about the way in which we kind of attribute um, a kind of Aristotelian character or overtone or whatever you want to call it to contemporary work on well-being, like psychological, social scientific work on well-being. And my concern is this, essentially, is that I think Aristotle had quite a kind of complex account of well-being and flourishing. Very interesting, but requires subtle analysis. And if you take an example like the work of Martin Seligman, for example, on positive psychology and character strengths. I mean, it's kind of similar to Aristotle in important ways, but different as well in important ways. And I just think my point is just we should be aware of those differences and
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge them when present. Just I think to bring, if only to bring some conceptual precision to the field and to the way in which we are kind of painting the history. I'm not saying, importantly, that it's not that we shouldn't kind of try and like think about the applications of Aristotle and Aristotelian insights on virtue to contemporary psychology. But I think that yeah, we just need to be a bit careful. And I mean, maybe some areas where there are differences between, say, like the kind of positive psychology movement and Aristotle might be, for example, that I think Aristotle probably had a much more substantive and kind of perfectionistic account of the human good than you would find in contemporary social psychology, positive psychology, I should say. So that is to say that I mean, positive psychology might have a series of character traits that it talks about as kind of important and introduces into its measurements and encourages people to cultivate like
Mm-hmm.
kind of basic human virtues like honesty or optimism or hope or uh, um, uh, courage. But I think that in the end, often there's more of a focus on kind of subjective and individual circumstances of the person's life in terms of interpreting what those virtues actually mean. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
for Aristotle, there's probably a lot more kind of objective content built into it. So that's a very brief sketch of maybe my concern about like how Aristotle relates to contemporary psychology. And then there's one other little piece which I'd add. Sorry for going on too long,
No,
but I
no, not
think
at
that
all.
yeah, the other thing is that there's a little bit of a kind of this connection between contemporary philosophical reflection on well-being and Aristotle, and I think it's fundamentally related to this. In the contemporary philosophical literature on well-being, there's a taxonomy given of different theories of well-being, which is based on three broad categories. The first is hedonistic accounts of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So well-being is just pleasure, a kind of surfeit of pleasure and pain. Desire satisfaction accounts of well-being. So well-being is fundamentally about satisfying your desires and others' desires or preferences, and then also objective list accounts of well-being. So well-being is fundamentally a sort of some sort of list of goods um, that are constitutive of well-being, and to the extent that we kind of possess the different items on this list to greater or lesser degrees, to that extent we have well-being. So that comes from Derek Parfit, who's a very influential analytic philosopher, and that's shaped contemporary philosophical conversations on well-being, at least in the Anglophone analytic tradition. And that's all well and good, right? But my concern with that taxonomy is that there's a big question about like how does someone like Aristotle fit into that taxonomy? How does something like flourishing fit into that taxonomy? Is it reducible to any one of those categories? Is it a mix? Is it something different? And that's what we explore in the paper. So I'll leave it to the audience to have a closer look at that. But my sort of executive summary is that I think Aristotle in the end is kind of something over and above, something slightly different to those three categories.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. That's really helpful. And so when going then, I guess, to flourishing at the end of life, this idea of At when dying, basically, I guess, is how you talked about this idea that if flourishing, I think you sort of make the argument, or the logic flows that I guess flourishing is about. And please just interject if I'm getting this completely wrong, but this idea of, growing, like, of, becoming your best self, becoming stronger. Well, that's not necessarily what's happening at end of life. So I guess you're sort of introducing this idea of sort of a context based flourishing. Is that a fair account of what you're sort of arguing here?
That's right, yeah. And I think that maybe important context for a paper like this would be the critique of the idea of flourishing as a kind of important focus for social science and other academic disciplines. The critique that flourishing is somehow focused on a kind of like thriving of human beings, and which has its kind of defining characteristic like some sort of perfection of human capacity. So kind of
Mm.
full intellectual capacity, full physical capacity. So you can imagine the kind of person, the human being in the prime of life, kind of middle aged, male, sort of athletic, um, sort of full kind of intellectual capacity,
Hmm.
kind of just absolutely crushing it at life and in all domains of life. So, and a lot of people look at that picture and they say, I mean, that's problematic in all sorts of ways if we kind of take that as our focus and definition of
Sure.
flourishing. I think like it's sort of it excludes certain groups of people. It's sort of a little bit like almost a little bit like eugenic in that it kind of makes a idol out of the perfection of human capacity to the exclusion of considering the place of vulnerability in human life.
Yep.
And also like in a way like where does someone who's at the end of life and really struggling sit in that picture? Where does someone who has a disability sit in that picture? Where does someone who has faced very significant challenges in life, out of their control, external challenges, sit in that picture if they have been unable to realize their kind of human capacities in the way they might otherwise have been able to? And I think that um, that's a really kind of interesting critique. And in fact, Paul Griffiths, a theologian in the United States, I think he's at Yale or Duke, but he wrote a critique actually of the work that my colleagues and I were doing at Harvard in a magazine called The Lamp, and it just came out a few months ago. So I'll share that link with you. But
Yeah.
he essentially argued this point. Like he said, there's a problem with the flourishing construct, and it's this that it kind of seems to be elitist essentially, and not make space for
Yeah.
the twilight of human life and the kind
Yeah.
of meaning and purpose that can be
Interesting.
attributed to that. So in terms of
Yeah.
want
And
to know about where would you like to go from here?
well,
That's the
just a
critique.
side note to say that I've no, I like it. It's, I mean, firstly, I love the idea that someone wrote a critique and then you've actually incorporated that into your work. That's really nice. I think that's the way this world is supposed to work, but it doesn't seem to always be the case. But I guess I've seen similar lines of argument where people who have criticized the WHO definition of mental health, which I think includes the term uh, fulfill your abilities or something, to the what does it say? Something like
Yeah, it's
reaching
sort
your
of
full
like
potential or
health is
something
not
like
just the
that.
absence of disease, but full physical, mental, and social well-being, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. There's a term in there that's like reaching your abilities, or getting the most out of your abilities, and like that's actually an impossible standard to set. Who can truly say they've absolutely exhausted the extent of their potential? Um, but it's interesting, and so my question, I guess, and this is, we had a couple of questions from the listeners, but one of them came in from Dr. Eri Mountbatten O'Malley, who kind of was going exactly where I was going a little bit, which is this idea of flourishing. Are you now considering flourishing? He sort of talked about this idea of flourishing despite one's circumstances, or I guess as you're sort of saying, in the context of one's circumstances, in the circumstance of dying or of aging. Where do you put the bracket around flourishing? Are you sort of saying that flourishing itself should include a consideration of one's limitations or context, or that there's flourishing as this perfectionistic sense, but there's another version of considering it with the circumstances?
Okay, that's a really
Does
good
that
question
does
from
that make
Eric.
sense?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. It definitely makes sense, I think, and
I
I think it's kind of fundamental in a way to the paper and its purpose. So, I mean, I I would say that there's a sense in which you can define flourishing generically and specifically. So, generically, flourishing might be something like thriving or realizing your capacity as a human being, or the kind of vigorous development of a living organism over time in accord with its telos, if you want to get really Aristotelian. Um, but then there's a kind of specific contextual sense in which you can define flourishing, and that might be something along the lines of realizing um, your potential for well-being or flourishing uh, relative to the circumstances in which you find yourself in life. A kind of indexing of the idea that kind of human nature provides a blueprint for flourishing to the specific circumstances of your life and the life stage in which you find yourself, perhaps most importantly or kind of
Mhm.
most universally. So I think there's a sense in which flourishing in childhood looks very different from flourishing in
Exactly.
adult life, kind of middle age, as
Yeah.
does flourishing in later life and even at the end of life. And for me, that's been a focus in my research in recent years, has been to consider how a kind of a life course model might apply and enrich, I think, our understanding of human flourishing such that we don't kind of reduce it to these sort of cookie cutter categories, whether people's lives are going well or badly, but rather that in a way and like kind of based on whether they've just developed basic human capacities, but rather that we take into account as well their life stage and, for example, whether in a way they're at the sort of denouements of life, the kind of later stage where perhaps certain goods come to the fore as more important, such as social relationships or meaning and purpose, and other goods might become a little less important. So, for example, health. By definition, your body is in decline as you age. Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the reality of aging in a certain sense. And so, if we place too much importance on kind of health or physical ability, you're going to basically rule out the possibility of well-being
Exactly.
in later life.
Yeah. Oh no, this is perfect. I'm thinking a little bit about some of our own work. This idea that we're trying, which we can probably chat about a bit later on, but um, to find a bit of a taxonomy of the dimensions of well-being, or what we're calling positive mental health, which I'll go into that later. But and it is a bit of an objective list, but obviously there's overlap with hedonism or hedonic tradition and with I guess desire satisfaction. But from a sort of a, maybe it's more of a psychometric perspective or very utilitarian, this idea of saying, there's a bucket of dimensions. Not all of them are on the cards for all people. There are limitations, but by having a broad perspective of what we mean by flourishing, there are certain levers you could pull to improve the way that you feel or that you're experiencing life. Is that
Yeah, it
can
definitely is on the money in terms of the way I see things. And I
yeah,
think that, yeah, that way of putting it is really nice. Like that there are levers that you can pull, but in a way, like the levers change depending on where you're at in life. So,
exactly.
so it might be, I think when you're young, for example, and you maybe don't think kind of professionally things are going as well as you thought they were, you can kind of just like apply yourself more and sort of like work harder
Yeah,
and kind of I don't know, like lean into the sort of like endless amounts of energy that you have when you're really young to sort of get ahead, and that's sort of a very kind of like logical way to sort of handle a situation where you're like, I want to sort of I don't know, like improve my professional standing or kind of become better at my field and what I do. So you kind of just basically like work harder. Like, I think when you're like 75 and you're kind of faced with a situation where things are kind of like winding down in terms of your sort of those life projects. Um, the way to improve your well-being is not to say, okay, let's just like rail like hell against the the sort of the sort of ebbing of that aspect of my life. but rather the solution, I think, is to adjust and to recognize that circumstances are different, and to lean into those other aspects of your life that can provide meaning and purpose. So, for example, like I think trying to consolidate relationships, trying to
Exactly.
kind of share wisdom, trying to volunteer in the community and give back, and
Yeah.
share
Yeah.
those kind of insights and skills that you've cultivated over the course of your life.
Yeah, and that's where I'm like an example that's coming to me is like thinking of, sort of extreme plastic surgery, sort of, anti-aging kind of things where you see people just rejecting, I guess, trying not to put judgment on it, but rejecting, trying to, like you said, trying to rally against one particular part of what they might consider health, maybe is their appearance, instead, and like in vain, right? Because it's not really probably generally
That's
working
right.
that well. Rather, they could be focusing on other aspects of their of flourishing that are opening up. The opportunities for those things are actually opening up in their life. Like you say, you could be doing more in the community, maybe if you're not working as much, or fill in other opportunities.
Yeah, there's a great quote from David Foster Wallace in This Is Water, where he talks about how like you should really seriously consider basing your life and kind of centering your life and values on some sort of transcendent source of meaning or purpose. Because if that's not what you worship, pretty much everything else will eat you alive. And he talks about beauty and how basically, like,
Really.
if you want to be beautiful, you'll always feel ugly. If you want money, you'll always feel like you never have enough. If you want to be kind of an intellectual, you always feel like you're a fraud, stupid, kind of not making the cut. And it's a really deep point, I think, is that unless we have transcendent sources of meaning in our life and kind of a transcendent focus, which in a sense is sort of informing our approach to flourishing, we are always going to end up feeling like we never have enough of whatever it is that whatever kind of, if you will, like temporal good we've chosen to make an idol of. So
Sure.
I think there's something quite deep here.
Yeah, no, definitely. And let me just do justice to Aries' specific question, because I guess the first one was kind of where I was going, but I want to read his specifically. So he said, what do you think the role is of perception in terms of flourishing through difficulty? Does it trump what we might call objective circumstances? Are there risks of delusion or wishful thinking? Or does your suggestions in the paper indicate rather a beneficent choice over styles of perception, e.g., agency over attitudes?
I think I understand the general focus of that question, and it's a very good one again. I think that, uh, I mean, in the paper, we try to push back against the idea that external circumstances fix flourishing,
Yes,
that external
exactly.
circumstances alone kind of determine capacity to flourish. So we definitely lean into the idea that there's a lot in perception and attitude that can shift the needle on flourishing. We make the point that you shouldn't, if you will, completely ignore the circumstances. So we do say that, in a sense, you need a modified account of flourishing because, by definition, when
Mm-hmm.
you're terminally ill, health is in decline. So that needs to be taken into account. That can't be kind of ignored or just like, yeah, you can't sort of just try and deny that. But we think that rather than, if you will, falling into that trap, we fall into another trap. And that is to say that flourishing is just off the cards, off the table, so to speak, when you're kind of at the end of life. And I think that's an assumption that, at the very least, requires critical reflection
Mm-hmm.
and interrogation. And we try to put a little bit of pressure on it in the paper. So, I mean, I think to answer Ari's question, um, I think it's a bit of both, and I think you've got to keep both of you. And in a way, that's very kind of Aristotelian. Is this sort of a hybrid account of well-being, where you're taking into account both objective and subjective features, and trying to kind of provide a sort of holistic, comprehensive account of flourishing. So, um, yeah, I think that, I mean, just very briefly, like the delusion point is interesting, and it is true to say that I think, interestingly, in clinical care at the end of life, like this is actually a problem because people can sometimes have false hope. And it's a question for a doctor. Like, do I sort of tell a patient, actually, you've got no chance of recovering from this condition, when they say, oh, well, I'm really hopeful that this new kind of experimental therapy is going to work, or
Yeah.
I'm really hopeful that a miracle is going to happen. Like, what do you say? Do you kind of affirm that sentiment? Do you say nothing? Do you try and challenge it? So I think we probably need some sort. Actually, yeah, to answer that question, we probably need some sort of account of like what flourishing is and what are the limits of kind of perception in terms of moving the needle. And say when you've reached that limit, do you kind of try and help someone to have more realistic assessments of the state of their own life and
Hmm.
kind of immediate future?
Yeah, oh man, these are tough questions. We've got a funded research project at the moment. I'm just thinking about some of the. I wrote my own critique of a work last year, which was pushing back against this idea of basically the relationship between well-being and mental illness being bipolar. Sort of opposite ends of the same spectrum. And I think one of the strongest arguments against that idea is that you're making flourishing an impossible opportunity for those with a diagnosed mental illness. So I guess my head does go to that dimensional world where it's like, all right, if you have something like depression, which I think is where this idea of having well-being despite depression is the most sort of theoretically challenging. If you're defining well-being as happiness, well, that's probably not the case. You're not going to be that happy with depression. But if you expand your definition to include things that are not ridiculous, things like a sense of autonomy, a sense of self-congruence, things like warm relationships, optimism, then you think, oh, some of these things might actually be realizable, basically, despite these circumstances.
That's right.
And
I mean, yeah, you finished. Sorry.
no, please, no. I was going to say we have a project at the moment with terminal, well, people with a diagnosis of cancer that is an incurable cancer, and this idea that I could just imagine we've done a little bit of work with consumers and saying to them, actually, well-being's off the cards. That is just not their reality. It's not their expectation, and it's just not what they have seen in their life.
That's right. I think there's something about like these prejudices that human beings have towards, say, yeah, based on whatever it could be, sort of race or sex or ability, or disability. Like we have these kind of isms, sexism, racism, ableism, that I think are issues in societies and so forth, and we kind of need to be aware and try to reduce and eliminate the presence of those things. But I think there's something like one of those isms, sorry, like all of those isms, uh, in relation to illness, and it's something
Mm-hmm.
along the lines of basically when you're kind of sick, physically or mentally, that as you say, like well-being is not possible anymore. That there's a kind of ceiling to the sort of meaningfulness or uh, fulfillment that you can have in life. And once you sort of reach that ceiling, that's the limit. And you're just sort of, in a way, you're kind of in a different category to other human beings, with respect to your ability to function. And we know that flourishing, our concepts of well-being and our concepts of dignity are often like very closely related to each other.
Yes.
So that's why I think we need to be quite careful about this, because I think, and you see this, maybe we're going to get to this in a second, but you see this in the euthanasia debate, where I think that misconceptions about quality of life in the context of serious illness lead people to support euthanasia. And what's going on, the thought process behind that is the idea that indeed it's reasonable to think that capacity to live a kind of worthy or worthwhile life in these situations is very limited, if not entirely absent. And as a result, we can, so to speak, set aside our kind of dignity-based objection to intentional killing of another human being, and allow it in these contexts, given the sort of deficit or absence of well-being, of quality of
Mm-hmm.
life, and as a result of dignity. So I think there's a kind of very sort of pernicious logic there, because I mean, and my concern is, even we can disagree about the morality of euthanasia for terminal illness, but I mean, if you really follow that logic to its conclusion, then you end up basically with a kind of euthanasia on demand for people who feel like their capacity to flourish is severely limited. So
Exactly.
that's my most fundamental concern.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I kind of just feel like it, it undermines, like you say, human dignity, but it's almost like you hear these horror stories, I guess, or I would call them horror stories. I don't even know if they're true, so just bear with me, I guess. But like Canadians, someone, I think there was a story where someone got, they needed a ramp installed. I think they were even like a Paralympian or something. They needed a ramp installed at their house. The waiting list was 18 months, and one of the like potential solutions was like, have you considered this option? And it was a euthanasia flyer, which is like just insane, completely insane. And I think, even to the letter of the law would be a misapplication, right? So fair enough, it's maybe an outlier, but those extreme cases, I think, do demonstrate what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I mean, we need to be careful. We know our society and how these, like when you kind of allow for the possibility, just the possibility, it may not be your intention, but that it becomes possible that vulnerable people can be exploited in different ways. When you kind of allow for that possibility, you can have all the goodwill in the world, but like we know that the way our societies and economies work is different, and that there's a kind of structural aspect to these issues. Where in this case, it's kind of like an economic rationalism that has been applied there, where it's sort of, okay, well, it's cheaper. It's cheaper to give you this other medical treatment. So, I mean,
Yeah.
isn't it reasonable to consider this? So, I think we just need to know ourselves, and we need to know the kind of fallen state of our world, and we can't be naive about this. I think some people call it scaremongering, but I think we can't be naive about how
Yeah.
vulnerable people often
Well,
end up the worst off in these situations.
yeah. And if we're going back, I guess, if we're thinking of someone who's trying to like sort of vainly, I don't know, vain's a judgmental word, but who's trying to desperately cling on to their beauty, and they're just looking at their life, they're judging their life on a very narrow band of what it means to live well in their perspective. Is it, because there was a listener question around, you did mention how this sort of looking for opportunities for existential or moral growth as part of flourishing at the end of life could change assessments for euthanasia and assisted suicide. Is there part of that, of what you're saying, is if we did bring this idea of flourishing within the circumstances of end of life, that there is a broadening of the terms that you could define your life well lived?
That's correct. That's exactly right, Matt. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, in the end, the discipline of palliative care interrogates people's assumptions about quality of life and tries to help them to see that, in fact, often those assumptions are not entirely correct, or kind of misguided, and that, in fact, um, when you've got a terminal illness, I mean, sure, you may be kind of limited and have this sort of definitive time horizon to your life, but I think that and suffering, but I think that also, like, that there are still these other goods that are available to you. So that, for example, like, I think palliative care physicians and teams will often help um, people who come into their care to have a closer relationship with significant others in their life, with family, to reconnect with people with whom, like loved ones whom with whom they may be estranged, family members with whom they may be estranged. I think that there's that. But then, in a sense, there's also like this deeper point, which is that it's not just that you should consider these things when you're dying, like reconciling with family, or uh, praying, or a kind of reconnecting with some spiritual transcendent source of meaning. It's not just like you should consider these things. It's actually that those things are kind of uniquely realizable in a deeper way at the end of life. And that's, I think, probably the most powerful point in our paper, is that, in fact, it's not just that you can have kind of a minimal level of quality of life or kind of well-being or flourishing,
Yeah.
but in fact, there's a sort of maximal character to it, which is greater in some domains than in other times of life, and that I think is a really beautiful thought. And you see it. I mean, perhaps the best
That is
example is the
I did
writings
not
of
pick
Leo.
that up. That's great.
Yeah. And the best examples maybe are like the writings of Leo Tolstoy. I mean, his two short stories, The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Master and Man. I mean, they're both stories about men who have lived a kind of selfish, self-interested life, but who basically um, die giving their life for others, like with this kind of selfless love and beneficence, and they die peacefully, and in a way, not just peacefully, but actually kind of like invigorated, more alive than they ever had been. And that's an insight I think that our culture has lost, and something that we need
Yeah.
to recover.
Fantastic. That's really powerful. You're making me regret some of the lame versions of that I sort of tell, this idea that, anyway, it doesn't matter. Very cool. So last couple of minutes, is there anything, you've probably explained it, but if just to make it like a little soundbite, basically, is there anything that you'd like to see change as a result of these sort of position papers that you've put out?
So my hope would be that we end up bridging the divide between, I think, the philosophy of well-being and kind of these sort of like rich reflections on the nature of well-being, and on the other hand, kind of specific practical kind of professional disciplines or kind of areas of inquiry. So by that I mean like medicine, economics, psychology, um, uh, child well-being studies, educational theory, neonatology, like the list goes on. Like I think in the end, gerontology. I
Mm-hmm.
think in the end, like we need to kind of really lean into the possibilities of like reimagining the way we conceptualize well-being in all these different practical areas, um, so that we can deliver better outcomes for people. Because this is what it is about. We want to create a better society, and the first thing we need to do is think about like what that actually means. What does flourishing mean, both individually and collectively? And for too long, I think in the kind of contemporary era, we've just reduced it to really crude metrics like GDP or kind of even HDI, which is a bit better, but still like radically deficient. And we haven't really thought about, okay, well, what, like, does it look different at different life stages? That's sort of the good life. Like, is my worth and well-being really defined by my economic productivity? Like,
Mm.
who came up with the idea that we could reduce well-being to that? I mean, that kind of crude indicator. Like, in what kind of a world did we think that that was a reliable, holistic indicator? And I suppose we didn't, but we thought it was kind of the best option available at the time. But here's news: like we've got better options now. So let's use the tools of this kind of academic discipline to well-being studies to try and enrich the way we conceptualize well-being in
Yeah.
social and political life.
No, that's awesome. It definitely feels like the time where we say, we've confused what were initially intended to be indicators. We've confused them with absolute truth. Like you say, GDP is an indicator, but once we sort of started conflating it as like, no, this is well-being, we've made an error. So it's a time to revisit all of that. What are you working on next?
So, I mean, I would hope to. That's a good question, actually. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm sort of at the stage. I'm actually just like thinking about the question at the moment, like
Oh,
what might
cool.
be a good next project. I am sort of drafting a paper on flourishing in later life, so looking specifically at kind of gerontology, and I think it's distinct from flourishing at the end of life insofar as I actually think that like we've got to be careful about defining life after retirement as a kind of like just gradual kind of sort of period of decline ending
Mm-hmm.
in death like that you can sometimes see. It seems like the way in which well-being is defined in the gerontology literature sort of has that kind of assumption. So I'm trying to like offer a more holistic account of the possibilities for meaning, purpose, and agency in later life. I'm writing that with a colleague, Julian Savulescu, at the University of National University of Singapore. So there's that, and then hopefully, yeah, I think just trying to also do some careful work in the bioethics space surrounding some some of these kind of new emerging technologies that might have implications in healthcare, artificial intelligence, robotics, psychedelics. So considering those areas as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Xavier. This has been really a thrilling conversation. Is there anything we've missed, or anything last that you wanted to say?
No, I think we've solved the world's problems. So
Yeah. All right. It was that easy. Only took us 55 minutes. So, very cool. Where can people find you? Well, I've tuned into one of your series at the Catholic University. It was really valuable. I see there's another one coming up. So where can we
that's
find you?
right. Yeah. So we do regular webinars at the Plunkett Centre for Ethics. So just drop me a line if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. Also, you can find us on the ACU website. I also, I'm quite active on social media, always keen to connect and have a chat about common research interests. So terrific. Okay, great to chat, Matt.